At the height of the Renaissance, in the early 16th century, Pope Julius II commissioned the artist Raphael to decorate his apartments at the Vatican. Among the series of frescoes Raphael painted for the papal suite is the celebrated School of Athens, a mural featuring dozens of philosophers from Greek antiquity. The composition draws the viewer's eye to the two central figures. The old man on the left is Plato, who raises his arms and points upwards towards the heavens and the uncorrupted world of ideal forms. He is accompanied by his student Aristotle, who extends his arm horizontally towards the viewer, indicating that truth is to be found in the real world. Both Plato and Aristotle are among the most important thinkers in human history. But it was the latter whom medieval Christians simply called the philosopher. The moniker highlights the scale of Aristotle's intellectual interests, from logic and ethics, arts and literature, to the natural and social sciences. Aristotle has been hailed as the father of several academic disciplines, and while many of his scientific theories have since been refuted, he was a pioneer of the scientific method, and his work on politics, ethics, logic, and rhetoric continue to be influential. This is the story of Aristotle, history's most prolific philosopher. The man known to history as Aristotle, or Aristoteles in Greek, was born in 384 BC in Stagira, a city in the ancient kingdom of Macedon, in what is now northeastern Greece. Despite his influence and fame over the centuries, there are very few reliable biographical details about Aristotle. Most of the details of his life come from the Lives and Opinions of Eminent Philosophers, a compilation of biographies of Greek philosophers by the writer Diogenes Laertius, who lived in the 3rd century AD, more than 5 centuries after Aristotle lived. Although Laertius quotes several older biographies of Aristotle, none of them have survived antiquity. Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, was a physician in the service of King Amyntas III of Macedon. He was a member of the Asclepiadae, a guild of physicians who claimed descent from Asclepius, the Greek god of medicine. Aristotle's mother was a woman named Phestis, whose family hailed from Chalcis in Euboea, a large island on the Aegean Sea close to Athens. Besides Aristotle, the couple had 2 other children, a son named Arimnestus and a daughter named Arimneste. Aristotle is believed to have been the youngest child in the family. Little is known for certain about Aristotle's childhood, but his father's association with King Amyntas indicates that the young Aristotle may have spent some time at Pella, the capital of the Macedonian kingdom. Macedon was located in the periphery of the Greek world, though its kings claimed descent from the legendary hero Heracles. Following a period of political turmoil and succession intrigue among members of the Macedonian royal dynasty, Amyntas had come to the throne in 393 BC, after assassinating his predecessor Pausanias, ushering in a period of relative political stability that ended with his death in 370 BC, which triggered a further decade of court intrigue until Amyntas's 3rd son, King Philip II, consolidated power in the early 350s BC, and transformed his kingdom into a military powerhouse that would conquer Greece 2 decades later. By the time of Aristotle's birth, Macedon was a rising power, but its rise to hegemonic status was far from guaranteed. The future Philip II was born in 382 BC, 2 years after Aristotle, and the two may have known each other as boys. Although Aristotle was to spend much of his life and career in Athens, he would maintain his connections to the Macedonian court throughout his life. In accordance with the tradition of the Asclepiadae, as a boy, Aristotle would have received medical training from his father. These early studies encouraged Aristotle's lifelong interest in biology and the natural sciences. According to biographical tradition, Aristotle's parents died when he was in his early teens, and his upbringing was entrusted to a relative named Proxenus, who was married to his sister Arymneste. In around 367 BC, when Aristotle was 17 years old, he went to Athens to study at Plato's academy. The academy had been founded in the 380s BC by Plato on part of his private estate, which had previously been a sacred olive grove dedicated to Athena, the city's patron goddess. It was an elite institution with a formal membership, and Aristotle's connections to the Macedonian court may have granted him the privilege of studying at the school. Since Plato was away in Sicily when Aristotle joined the academy, the two men would have only met a few years later when Plato returned to Athens. Aristotle's relationship with Plato has been a subject of intellectual interest over the centuries, with Raphael's school of Athens being a prime example. According to Diogenes Laertius, Aristotle had been the most genuine student of Plato, suggesting that as a young man he had been a faithful follower of Plato's ideas. The scholar Georgios Anagnostopoulos observes that Aristotle's surviving writings from his period in the academy is closely aligned with Plato's approach to philosophy. Plato's own work was confined to a relatively narrow field of philosophical studies, including metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and political theory. But he encouraged the pursuit of all forms of knowledge, including mathematics and the natural sciences. Aristotle wrote several philosophical dialogues in the Platonic tradition, examining ideas in the form of debates between various speakers. While none of Aristotle's dialogues have survived, they were quoted by later writers such as Cicero, who praised his style. Aristotle's dialogues about rhetoric provoked a lengthy feud with the prominent orator Isocrates and his followers. Isocrates was interested in the application of rhetorical theory in political and civic life, while Aristotle saw rhetoric as a tool of persuasion through rational argument, sharing Socrates and Plato's concern that rhetoric was being misused by politicians to appeal to emotions rather than reason. Aristotle's surviving treatise on rhetoric includes ideas that he developed during his 2 decades at the academy. Although Aristotle would reject many of Plato's ideas, he continued to respect him and speak fondly of his former associates in the academy. The Aristotelian scholar Jonathan Barnes notes that, despite Aristotle's differences with Plato, the two shared an interest in formulating a universal theory of human knowledge. Aristotle's efforts to systematize the study of human knowledge is reflected in his writings on logic, which most scholars attribute to his time at the academy. Aristotle wrote that he was the first person to conduct a systematic study of logic, and his followers would later compile 6 of his treatises on logic into the Organon, or instrument, to reflect their view that logic was a tool to make philosophical deductions. Aristotle's most influential logical treatises are Prior Analytics and Posterior Analytics. In the former, he introduces a style of argument he calls the syllogism or deduction, which enables a thinker to draw certain conclusions based on proper categorization of terms. A commonly cited example of the syllogism is "all men are mortal." Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The statement is true because all men are a subset of mortal beings. Socrates is an individual who falls within the category of all men. So Socrates must also belong to the larger category of mortals. While the premise "all men are mortal" refers to universal categories, Aristotle also identified particular premises where something belongs to a part of a category, enabling him to infer some mammals are cows from the premise some cows are mammals. Aristotle pioneered the use of letters of the alphabet to express the universality of these syllogistic relationships he identified. Some A is B. Therefore, sum B is A. Aristotle's posterior analytics considers how scientific knowledge can be obtained by making a series of deductions or demonstrations from first principles or axioms that are self-evident. In a treatise from the Organon known as the Categories, Aristotle places everything that exists within 10 distinct categories, including substances, quantities, and qualities. However, Aristotelian scholars have struggled to explain why he does not apply the methodical, logical reasoning he sets out in the Organon in his later surviving work. Jonathan Barnes argues that Aristotle's logic could only be used for a complete science, and much of Aristotle's later work involved collecting data and establishing and defining categories. The reasons for Aristotle's departure from the Academy around the time of Plato's death in 347 BC are also the subject of extensive scholarly speculation. Diogenes Laertius wrote that Aristotle left the Academy while Plato was still alive, and claimed that Plato said of him, "Aristotle spurns me, as colts kick out at the mother who bore them." One factor behind Aristotle's departure may have been the rise of anti-Macedonian sentiment in Athens after King Philip II brutally sacked Olynthus in northern Greece in 348 BC. Many scholars argue that Aristotle left the Academy shortly after Plato's death because he was disappointed that Plato had named his nephew Speusippus as his successor. The American philosopher Christopher Shields suggests that Aristotle left Athens to pursue a compelling research opportunity and continued to correspond with his colleagues at the Academy. Georgios Anagnostopoulos likewise warns against attributing Aristotle's departure from the Academy to any major disagreement with Plato or his successors. In 347 BC, Aristotle was invited to Asia Minor by Hermias of Atarneus. Hermias had previously been a slave to Eubulus, a banker who had gained control of the city-states of Atarneus and nearby Assos. Hermias was highly valued by Eubulus, who sent him to Athens to study with Plato. Hermias returned to Atarneus shortly before Eubulus's death in 351 BC, and took control of the government himself. The Aristotelian scholar Werner Jaeger has argued that the intellectual circle that Hermias was building in Atarneus was affiliated with the Academy in Athens. Whatever troubles Aristotle may have had in Athens, Hermias's offer would have been extremely attractive. Hermias was not only Aristotle's friend from the Academy, but was also an ally of King Philip of Macedon. Aristotle also had kinship ties with the city of Atarneus, which was the birthplace of his guardian, Proxenos. The greatest attraction for Aristotle may have been the opportunity to conduct independent research in biology. Aristotle was 37 years old and had spent more than half his life studying from and collaborating with an elite group of scholars at the Academy, but he may have had limited opportunities to pursue his interests in the natural sciences in Athens. Hermias established research facilities for Aristotle and his Academy colleague Xenocrates at Assos, in what is now northwestern Turkey. The Acropolis of Assos, where the surviving Doric columns of the Temple of Athena continue to overlook the Aegean Sea and the nearby island of Lesbos, proved an ideal location for Aristotle to study land animals and marine creatures. After 2 to 3 years in Assos, Aristotle continued his studies in Lesbos, where he was joined by Theophrastus, another former student of the Academy who was to be a close friend and collaborator. Aristotle recorded his pioneering biological and zoological research in several books, including The History of Animals, in which he described the forms, functions, and habits of a wide range of animals from insects to whales. The place names cited by Aristotle in his biological works indicates that he carried out the research while based in Assos and Lesbos. Without the benefit of microscopes, some of Aristotle's findings were later refuted, such as his belief that some insects were brought into being from non-living matter that inspired the theory of spontaneous generation, which was widely accepted until the 19th century. However, many of his descriptions have stood the test of time, and his process of collecting data from his observations and the writing up of his findings remains foundational to the scientific method. Aristotle described his process by ascertaining the development of chicks. He took an egg from under a brooding hen every day, cracked it open, and recorded details of the embryo. While this was not strictly an experiment, since Aristotle could not guarantee that the chicks in each egg would develop at the same rate, it illustrates the practical methods that Aristotle used to collect information. While Aristotle conducted research himself, his work was also informed by collaborators such as Xenocrates and Theophrastus, as well as the information he gathered from fishermen, hunters, and farmers who had greater familiarity with certain types of animals. Aristotle also studied the works of earlier philosophers such as Pythagoras and Democritus in order to inform his own research into particular subjects. While his work on zoology and biology had few precedents, making him a true pioneer in these fields, Aristotle preferred to cite tradition where it existed. He placed great value on reputable opinions, which were widely accepted, and used these hypotheses as the starting point for his own research, which may align with the traditional view in some ways and challenge it in others. Aristotle is well known for rejecting Plato's theory of forms, which proposed that all objects and ideas can be abstracted into ideal forms, which represent ultimate reality. While Aristotle was primarily interested in seeking truth from observation, he believed the theory of forms was worthy of serious consideration and used it as the basis for his own investigations into form and matter, which were later collated into a single book called the Metaphysics, which also examined the existence of numbers and other mathematical objects. One of Aristotle's major contributions to philosophy was to establish categories for certain types of knowledge. He divided the sciences into three categories: the productive sciences, including arts and crafts, as well as literature and poetry. The practical sciences concerned proper conduct in society and included ethics and politics. But by far the largest category was theoretical, the pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, which he further divided into the components of mathematics, natural science, and theology. Aristotle's study of the natural sciences in Assos and Lesbos came to an end in the late 340s BC, when King Philip II of Macedon invited him to his court at Pella to serve as tutor to his teenage son Alexander, the man better known to history as Alexander the Great. Aristotle assumed his post around the time that his friend and patron Hermias was removed from power by a Greek mercenary named Mentor, acting on the orders of the king of Persia, who sought to re-establish Persian rule in Asia Minor in response to rumors that the Macedonians were planning to invade Persia. Even though King Philip refused to come to his rescue, Hermias refused to betray Macedonian plans to invade Persia and was tortured to death in 341 BC. Diogenes Laertius quotes a hymn by Aristotle dedicated to Hermias, praising his virtues. Aristotle maintained his connections to his late patron by marrying a young woman named Pythias, who was Hermias' daughter or niece. Pythias bore Aristotle a daughter, also named Pythias, and she may have also been the mother of Aristotle's son Nicomachus. By the time Aristotle returned to Pella, he was in his early 40s and was regarded as one of the greatest minds of the age. His student, Alexander, was 12 or 13 and had already received extensive military training. The lessons took place at an existing private school for Macedonian noble children at Mieza, a royal estate near Pella, where Alexander likely studied alongside his young companions Hephaestion, Ptolemy, and Cassander. Aristotle was close friends with Cassander's father Antipater, a powerful Macedonian general and statesman who was a member of Philip II's inner circle and would go on to serve Alexander faithfully after Philip's death. Aristotle only taught Alexander for 2 to 3 years, since by the time the prince turned 15, he was already serving as his father's deputy commander on campaign. While there are few details about what Aristotle taught Alexander, this period is one of the most important episodes in Aristotle's biography, and has invited much speculation on the relationship between the two men. It is widely believed that Aristotle placed heavy emphasis on Homer, the tragic poet, inspiring Alexander's love of the Iliad and his efforts to emulate Achilles. Most scholars believe that Aristotle also taught Alexander politics and ethics to prepare him for kingship, and that he wrote 2 works for Alexander under the titles On Monarchy and On Colonies, which are both lost. While Aristotle may have offered political advice to Hermias of Ateneus while he was working in Assos and Lesbos, it is likely that he began seriously considering political questions while serving as Alexander's tutor. During this period, Aristotle may have begun his project to document 158 constitutions of the Greek world to examine their strengths and weaknesses. These constitutions were not founding political documents, but descriptions of a state's political arrangements and how they evolved over time. Apart from a papyrus copy of Aristotle's Constitution of Athens, discovered in Egypt in the 19th century, the other constitutions from Aristotle's collection have not survived. This major research project, nevertheless, informed his surviving political treatise, Politics, a term which Aristotle used to describe the governance of the Greek city-state, or polis. Aristotle's famous statement that men are by nature political animals reflects his belief that humans are distinguished from other animals by their reason, and thus an ability to make ethical and value judgments, and that this common characteristic encourages the formation of the household and the state. Even as King Philip of Macedon was subjugating the Greek world to his will, while Aristotle was tutoring his son Alexander, Aristotle continued to believe that city-states of less than 100,000 men were the natural form of political organization. Aristotle's teacher, Plato, had written his own political treatise, The Republic, which is considered the first work of political theory. However, by researching the existing constitutional arrangements of over 150 Greek city-states, Aristotle was seen as the father of political science. Plato had identified 5 forms of government: aristocracy, the rule of the best citizens; timocracy, the rule of men motivated by honor; oligarchy, the rule of a small group of wealthy men; democracy, which he equated to mob rule; and tyranny, the despotic rule of one person. Plato believed that a state which began as an aristocracy would eventually degenerate through the other forms of government into tyranny, and considered measures to maintain the rule of his philosopher kings. Aristotle instead identified 3 distinct categories of constitutions based on whether power was in the hands of a single person, a few people, or many people. These 3 categories were in turn subdivided into a good form and a bad form. While Aristotle believed that a monarchy could be justified if the ruler or ruling family had exceptional abilities, he recognized that single-man rule could easily descend into tyranny, which was to be avoided at all costs. Likewise, Aristotle identified virtues in aristocratic constitutions, but feared that the aristocrats would be corrupted by wealth and power and become oligarchs. Aristotle was less critical of democracy than Plato, but he argued that democracies were prone to instability as rival factions vied for power. Aristotle pragmatically concluded that the most stable constitution was a type he called polity, where the elite and the masses shared power for the common good of the state. This was, in effect, a mixed constitution that combined elements of aristocracy and democracy. While Aristotle's ideas on the ideal constitution inspired Montesquieu and John Locke's writings on separation of powers in the 18th century, Aristotle denied citizenship and political rights to women and slaves, and his ideal state also entails a highly interventionist approach to social relations, in order to ensure that the state and its population works towards the common good. Aristotle's belief that city-states should avoid war but should be prepared to defend their independence against invaders was at odds with his royal patrons in Macedon. Little is known about Aristotle's activities after the 2 or 3 years he spent teaching Alexander, but he may have returned to his hometown of Stagira. According to Diogenes Laertius, the city had been destroyed by Philip II in 348 BC, but was rebuilt at the request of Aristotle, who drew up a model constitution for the city. In 336 BC, King Philip II of Macedon was assassinated by one of his bodyguards, leading to Alexander's accession to the throne at the age of 20. The following year, Aristotle left Macedon and returned to Athens. As with several other pivotal moments in Aristotle's life, his motives are unclear. While Aristotle remained in correspondence with Alexander, his opposition to Macedonian expansionism may have encouraged him to leave his homeland a second time. Over the following decade, Alexander invaded and conquered the Persian Empire, campaigning as far as India before turning back to Babylon, where he fell ill and died at the age of 32 in 323 BC. While Alexander's conquests have inspired military commanders over the centuries, his accomplishments disregarded Aristotle's teachings on ethics and politics. For Aristotle, politics was closely connected to ethics, and involvement in political life was an essential moral obligation. Aristotle's approach to ethics is informed by his biological theory that all beings have an end goal or telos. He argued that the telos for humans was eudaimonia, a term often translated as happiness, but which more accurately refers to flourishing or success. Aristotle believed that human flourishing is best achieved through intellectual pursuits, since humans are uniquely blessed with reason among animals. In Aristotle's view, Alexander's wars and conquests were antithetical to his own attainment of eudaimonia, and to those of his subjects. While Alexander conquered his way across the Persian Empire, Aristotle embarked on the most productive period of his life in Athens. Despite the differences in their political and ethical views, Alexander's patronage enabled Aristotle to establish his own school, known as the Lyceum, located outside the walls of Athens, named after a sanctuary of the god Apollo Lyceus. Unlike Plato's academy, the Lyceum was open to the public and also served as a gymnasium. Diogenes Laertius writes that the Aristotelian school of philosophy came to be known as peripatetic, a term that relates to walking because Aristotle would often walk about while lecturing to his students. However, the term peripatetic was not used in Aristotle's lifetime and is understood to be a reference to the covered walkways of the Lyceum. The Lyceum boasted a famous library, and the Roman geographer Strabo credits him as the first man to have a systematic collection of books, an approach which would inspire the creation of the Library of Alexandria. Later scholarship dates most of Aristotle's surviving work to his second period in Athens, since they resemble lecture notes that were not intended for publication, which were compiled by peripatetic scholars after his death. As an illustration of Aristotle's all-round excellence, Diogenes Laertius lists 143 works attributed to him, amounting to 445,270 lines in total. Many of the items in this list were falsely attributed to Aristotle, while known works which do not appear in Laertius's list may have been compiled from some of the items that do. Scholars have attempted to establish a chronology of Aristotle's output via cross-references within his works, references to historical events, and differences in style. However, none of these methods are fully reliable, since Aristotle was likely working on several treatises at the same time, and continuously updated them as he received new information. Aristotle's teaching at the Lyceum, as recorded in his surviving treatises, would have been informed by research conducted by his academic colleagues, including the faithful Theophrastus, who would go on to succeed Aristotle as head of the institution. Aristotle struggled with problems with chronology in his own time. Historians of the Greek world lacked an accepted system of chronology, and would date events in reference to the year an individual was holding a particular office, or when an athlete won a particular race in regular sporting competitions such as the Olympic Games. An inscription from Delphi dating from the 330s BC honours Aristotle and his great-nephew Callisthenes for their work compiling a list of the victors of the Pythian Games, a prestigious sporting competition and religious festival in Delphi, outranked only by the Olympic Games. Aristotle and Callisthenes used the archives in Delphi to establish an authoritative list of victors in chronological order. Callisthenes may have also contributed to a list of Olympic victors that Diogenes Laertius attributes to Aristotle. This work was likely carried out before Aristotle left for Athens, since Callisthenes accompanied Alexander on campaign as the king's official historiographer, leaving an account of Alexander's conquests which has now been lost. Although he hailed Alexander's prowess as a military leader, Callisthenes later criticized Alexander for adopting Persian customs and would die in prison after being implicated in a plot to assassinate the king. While Callisthenes was a historian of some repute, and Aristotle recognized the value of studying the past, he believed that history was nothing more than a series of idiosyncratic events, and that any lessons and knowledge acquired from history can only be applied in their particular contexts. In contrast, he believed that poetry and drama had a universal effect, since a dramatist can carefully organize the narrative to elicit the desired emotional responses. Aristotle's treatise Poetics was divided into two books, the first on tragedy and the second on comedy, of which only the former survives. Even though Aristotle's Poetics is considered the earliest work of literary criticism, since Aristotle regarded poetry as a productive science, his primary aim is not to appraise a work of literature or drama, but to set out instructions for how to create one. Aristotle argued that all art aims to imitate human life, and that tragedy is superior to comedy since tragedy represents serious matters. Although he recognized the aesthetic qualities of literature, he believed that the value of tragic drama was in its cathartic power to purge emotional responses such as fear and pity from the audience. Aristotle identified 6 elements that make up a tragedy: plot, character, thought, language, music, and spectacle. Of these, the plot is the most important, since it is the framework around which the drama unfolds and triggers emotional reactions from the audience via reversals and discoveries. Aristotle wrote that the most effective tragic plots involved a main character who is good and successful, but experiences adversity through some hamartia, or mistake, whose full and devastating consequences are only revealed as the drama reaches its climax. While the Greek term hamartia is now used in literary criticism to refer to a fatal character flaw, Aristotle does not attribute the mistake to the character of the tragic hero. Unexpected turning points were the key elements in the plot that gave the play its dramatic quality. But Aristotle believed that these had to be plausible to achieve the desired emotional impact. While Aristotle's ideas about how to produce an effective tragedy were based on his empirical research into the history of Greek drama and limited by the conventions of the day, his concepts have influenced European dramatists for centuries. While Aristotle authored influential treatises on literature, politics, and ethics, his work on the natural sciences has been equally influential right up until the modern age. Aristotle adopts the fundamental elements of earth, air, fire, and water. He categorized each of them based on how hot or cold or how wet or dry they are. Earth is cold and dry. Water is cold and wet. Air is hot and wet. And fire is hot and dry. He also attributed a natural direction of movement to the elements, with earth and water moving downwards and air and fire moving up. Aristotle believed that the earth was at the center of the universe, with celestial bodies such as the moon, the sun, and the planets moving around the Earth in concentric circles. Aristotle's treatise Meteorology, which described natural phenomena taking place in the space between the Earth and the Moon, is based on the notion of the Earth exhaling certain types of vapors and gases to explain weather events. In addition to the four classical elements, Aristotle introduced the term ether to describe the substance that celestial bodies were made from. He considered the heavenly bodies divine, since their circular motion appeared constant, while all things on Earth were subject to change. He believed that the universe is finite in space, but infinite in time, with no beginning and no end. Although the regular motion of the heavenly bodies gave them divine attributes, Aristotle proposed the existence of an unchanging primary divinity lying outside the universe. Aristotle was not a professional astronomer and relied on the work of his contemporaries Eudoxus of Cnidus and his student Callippus, both of whom were connected to Plato's academy. Nevertheless, his geocentric model of the universe was refined by the Alexandrian astronomer Claudius Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD and remained influential into the Christian era. In 16th century Europe, Nicholas Copernicus effectively turned Aristotle's universe inside out by placing the sun at its center, while describing the Earth's rotational and orbital motion. Copernicus's theory seemed absurd at the time, and it was only with more accurate observations and refinements that his heliocentric theory gradually superseded geocentrism. As with Aristotle's cosmology, much of his work on physics and chemistry began to be superseded in the 16th and 17th centuries as scientists applied quantitative methods and built a new world view supported by a firm mathematical foundation. Such methods were unavailable to Aristotle, since he lacked the instruments to measure concepts such as temperature or time with any accuracy or precision. Aristotle could divide the four elements into hot and cold, or wet and dry. But these terms were relative, and he had no thermometer or barometer to measure the temperature or humidity of any object. From observation, he knew that some animals were faster than others, but he could not measure the distance they traveled over a specific period of time. Aristotle had to build his theories around incomplete data. Since Aristotle observed that the world was made from earth and water at the bottom, with air above it, he imagined a sphere of fire beyond the air. In his biological treatise, Generation of Animals, Aristotle associates plants with the earth, marine creatures with water, land animals with the air, and supposes that there is a fourth type of creature associated with fire to be found on the moon, which lies within the sphere of fire. While this notion has subsequently been ridiculed, Jonathan Barnes cites several examples in Aristotle's works where he acknowledges the shortcomings of his observations and recognizes that his conclusions are subject to speculation. Aristotle's writings show that he prioritized empirical observation, but believed that unorganized data was meaningless without a theoretical framework. In his treatise, Parts of Animals, Aristotle noted that most animals had physical or behavioral traits that are particularly suited for essential functions, like the webbed feet which help ducks swim. These observations informed his belief that every being had an essential purpose that they were designed for, a concept that came to be known as teleology. More than 2,000 years after Aristotle, Charles Darwin would draw on the same connections between the form and function of animals to inform his theory of evolution. In addition to his extensive research output at the head of the Lyceum, Aristotle's second period in Athens also witnessed the birth of his only son Nicomachus, who may have given his name to Aristotle's influential ethical treatise, the Nicomachean Ethics. Diogenes Laertius cites the historian Timaeus of Tauromenium, who stated that Nicomachus was the son of a woman from Stagira named Herphilis, whom Aristotle had taken as his mistress after the death of his first wife Pythias. In 323 BC, Aristotle left Athens and transferred the leadership of the Lyceum to Theophrastus. Aristotle's second departure from Athens was likely connected to a resurgence of anti-Macedonian feeling after Alexander's death. Around this time, the tablet in Delphi that had celebrated Aristotle and Callisthenes' work in compiling the list of Pythian victors was smashed and thrown into a well, where it was discovered by archaeologists more than 2 millennia later. Aristotle retired to Chalcis, where his maternal relatives still lived, and he died a few months later in 322 BC, aged 62. Diogenes Laertius cites Aristotle's will, which offers a rare insight into Aristotle's private and family life. Aristotle's friend Antipater, whom Alexander had appointed to take charge of the Macedonian government while he was on campaign, was his general executor. Since his children were still young, he appointed as their guardian his nephew Nicanor, the son of his sister Aramneste, who was to marry his daughter Pythias once she came of age. He also instructed Nicanor to take care of his mistress Herpyllis and to free his slaves after they reached a certain age. The document ends with instructions on where to place statues he had commissioned of his mother and close friends. Despite his unconventional theological views, he demonstrated conventional religious piety by sponsoring statues of Zeus and Athena for the temple in his native Stagira. From his relative backwater on the periphery of the Greek world, Aristotle went to Athens as a teenager and became a mainstay at Plato's academy for 2 decades. Although he fundamentally disagreed with Plato, he respected and honored him as a teacher. After leaving the academy, Aristotle conducted pioneering research on biology and zoology under the patronage of his friend Hermias of Ateneus. Shortly before Hermias' fall from power, Aristotle returned to Macedon to tutor the future Alexander the Great. Although Alexander appears to have disregarded much of Aristotle's ethical and political teachings, he supported Aristotle's work at the Lyceum, where he produced a wide range of research in collaboration with academic colleagues. According to tradition, Aristotle transferred his writings and library to Theophrastus, who passed them down to his nephew Neleus, whose descendants kept them in a cellar for safekeeping. The collection deteriorated significantly by the time they were sold to the book collector Apellicon in the 1st century BC. After Apellicon's library was removed to Rome, the peripatetic philosopher Andronicus of Rhodes catalogued and edited Aristotle's works for publication, often grouping shorter texts into longer treatises. Modern scholars believe that Andronicus played a key role in establishing and preserving the Aristotelian corpus as we know it, but that copies of Aristotle's work were being circulated and discussed in the Greek world during the 2 centuries when the main collection was supposedly rotting away in a cellar. Aristotle's writings remained influential in the medieval era, both in Western Christendom and in the Arab world. Jonathan Barnes wrote of him, "He bestrode antiquity like an intellectual colossus. No man before him had contributed so much to learning. No man after him might aspire to rival his achievements." Although Aristotle relied on imperfect information to formulate his theories, such was the authority of his worldview that more accurate theories struggled to gain wider acceptance. Although Aristotle's theories have been overturned by modern science, his empirical approach and his emphasis on data collection and categorization continues to influence scientific thinking. Aristotle himself recognized that his theories could be superseded by new hypotheses formulated using higher quality data. Meanwhile, his writings on logic, ethics, politics, and poetics remain relevant more than 2,000 years after his lifetime. Just as Aristotle respected the thinkers who came before him, much of Aristotle's thought still merits serious consideration. What do you think of Aristotle? Was he one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived? Or did his authority across the full spectrum of human knowledge hinder the progress of scientific discovery and advancement? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.